as you mentioned it, together with your scientific curriculum, what makes you an important climate realist is that you were in the Obama administration, so not Trump or Bush Jr.'s administration. So you're not in the classical split that we observe in the US between Republicans and Democrats, because Democrats are climate alarmists, Republicans are climate deniers, even there are some of them who are also climate alarmists. But we don't see much of people coming from the Democrat side that are climate realists as you are. And probably you have, for this very position, makes you specific, and maybe you have specific things to say about what really is going on.
So for me, I've never thought about myself through a political lens. Mm-hmm. I have never been registered, become a member of either party, or in fact of any party. And in elections, I have voted actually on both sides, Republican and Democrat, depending upon who the candidates were. I like to think that I, as I would hope most scientists do, talk about these matters in an objective, factual way. And with respect to climate science, almost everything I'm telling to non-experts, I try to document by referring to the IPCC reports or the original research literature or the underlying data. So in that sense, I try to avoid getting tangled up in the politics.
But what was the feeling when we were in the Obama's administration? What was the general feeling inside, about the climate issue? Well, people were probably as clever as you are, able to understand the limitations of the models, but also the pressure, the political pressure. So behind the curtain.
Certainly climate was on the Obama administration's agenda. And I particularly was focused more on the energy technologies that we would need to reduce emissions. Which one should we be researching, developing, and demonstrating, and not so much at that time on the quality of the climate science. But I think if I fast forward to today's administration, there's a much greater passion and fervor to actually deploy technologies in an attempt to reduce emissions. We can talk about the wisdom of all of that and how well it's going at some point later in the conversation, but climate has assumed a much greater profile in the Biden administration than it did in the Obama administration.
Yeah, so you're saying that if you had understood earlier what were going on in the general theory, it would have been possible for you to be helpful at the time and convince people around.
I think I would have caused a much greater scrutiny of the science than I did at the time.
And now, something that's surprising when reading your book is that a lot of things you write could have been written by any IPCC member.
Yes.
So you agree with a lot of things. So as you said about the rising of CO2 in the atmosphere is caused by human emissions, and that the CO2 increases the temperature for a few degrees, at least theoretically. And what makes you different from the general theory of the IPCC?
Well, I try not to differ too much from them, but in fact just quote things that are not surfaced as people talk about the reports. So things that surprised me as I read into the reports in detail are some of the things that are in the book. For example, it's hard to find any trends over a century or so in hurricanes, which is a great surprise because all you hear on the news is that hurricanes are becoming more and more destructive and more frequent and so on. Just not the case. Similarly, when I read that the expected economic impact of a warming of 3 degrees was going to be just a few percent, I was really shocked because that's very different than climate catastrophe. Now, it may still be the case that there is a catastrophe, but that's not what the IPCC is saying. So it was things like that, as I read the reports, that motivated me to speak out a bit and try to expose to people what the reports were really saying, as opposed to what the media said they were saying, or the politicians said they were saying.
How do you explain that the IPCC contributors writing what you say they are writing do not react against medias or political parties that argue that we are in a climate apocalypse?
Yeah. So if I'm an ordinary working level climate scientist, and I've talked to many of those people, and most of them have a good scientific attitude. But when they see their work getting misrepresented, they don't have very much incentive to speak up and say, hey, wait a second, I didn't really say that. Or I said that, but in fact, you have to add these additional facts in. And so there's just no incentive for working level scientists to do that. In fact, there's a disincentive because they will get ostracized, cast out of the community, lose their funding, and so on. I've talked to many climate scientists about what I've written in the book, and none of them that I've talked to will say, Steve, you got that wrong.
Really? None of them?
Well, I mean, some will say, well, you should have done it this way or that way. One of them said, I agree with everything except one figure out of 70 I think is not right. So specific criticisms of the scientific things I've said, I've yet to find somebody who said I got it wrong. I would welcome such criticism, but it's not there.
And so, well, it's difficult to believe simply without more analysis that every single climatologist knows the truth but doesn't want to speak out.
I don't think
there is.
So the climate scientists also, you know, they tend to specialize in something. So there's a whole group of people who specialize in glaciers and ice sheets. And then there's a whole other group of people who specialize in storms. And they're not the same people. And so it's kind of hard for one to criticize another. But, you know, so here's a experience I had about a year ago. So the media, for example, the Guardian newspaper, had been publishing stories about Greenland is melting faster and faster. And they say over the last 30 years, the melt rate went up by 5 or 7 times. And I said, wow, that's interesting. So I'm going to go look at the entire data set to the extent that we have it. And the Danish Meteorological Institute does keep such a data set. And I simply published a graph of that in the Wall Street Journal. And what it shows is, in fact, it did get faster and faster from 1990 to 2010 or so. But it did the same sort of thing from 1920 to 1930. And the melt rate in 1930 was just about as strong as it was in 2015. And in fact, it's going down now over the last several years. And when I published that, it caused quite a bit of stir because everybody is thinking as carbon dioxide is going up, it's going to melt faster and faster. It's entirely not the case because the melt rate or ice loss rate is determined probably by some long-term cycles in the North Atlantic. So I published this, and then a week later, the scientists who were involved in the data set said, you know, Koonin's right. He published the data accurately. There's nothing wrong with that, but we disagree with the interpretation. I didn't hear their own interpretation. All right, but you know, so the scientists will grudgingly admit to many of the things I've written because it's their own work. Mm-hmm. It's just that they don't like to talk about it when it doesn't agree with the narrative.